ESG has been increasing, so environment, social governance issues has been increasing for a number of years, and it's a very live topic for all organisations at the moment. You know, regulators, investors, employees, customers increasingly expect organisations to act ethically and be sustainable. And that requirement or that expectation of us and our organisations extends to the wider supply chain, doesn't it? And the procurement activity and sourcing activity. So it's very topical. It's something a lot of our customers are talking to us about. And I'm delighted to have two subject matter experts today that are going to talk about what this means in kind of practical terms. So the first person you will hear from is Nnamdi Ahuchugu. Nnamdi works for Zurich Resilience Solutions, and he's a supply chain expert, working with our customers on supply chain management issues. And well, Nnamdi's been with Zurich for less than a year, but he's got 20 years experience in industry as a supply chain and procurement professional. So he really does have that kind of first-hand practical experience and knowledge of this topic, and also that longer term kind of how it has emerged and evolved over that time as well. And then the second person you're going to hear from is Chris Minter. And Chris is the Sustainable Sourcing Lead for Zurich globally. So Chris, again, very much that practical experience. He's working with our suppliers on a day-to-day basis to encourage and help them to be more sustainable, and also to ensure that Zurich as an organisation are acting ethically in how we engage with and work with the third parties that we work with. So again, someone coming with that kind of practical knowledge on a day-to-day basis. So he's going to give us some insight into what Zurich do and are doing to ensure that we remain sustainable and that we put ethics at the heart of our procurement as well. So I'm delighted they're both here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Nnamdi.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that fantastic introduction. Very much appreciated. And good day to everybody on the call. And as Alan previously said, you're very welcome to the first in our series of supply chain webinars. So the first of this series, we'll be talking about ethical and sustainable procurement and supply chains. Just a little bit more about my background. As Alan mentioned, I've had 20 years in procurement supply chain in various industries. I recently joined Zurich Resilience Solutions, and we hope that through these webinars we can provide thought leadership and risk insights, not just to our Zurich customers, but also to wider organizations around supply chain risks. And hopefully we hope you find this insightful and you find these topics and conversations of benefits. So the agenda for today is that we'll first look at a definition of what an ethical and sustainable procurement supply chain is, why it's important. We've got a short video to show you as well that links to the UN Sustainability Development Goals as well, which is one of the main drivers for the process. We'll also look at some drivers around supply chain and talk in some level of detail around these drivers, and then we'll look at barriers and challenges with ethical and sustainable procurement. It's not an easy roadmap, and we understand that there are a few issues around implementing this process. So we'll look at some of the barriers and challenges, and then we'll look at the journey and approach for your organizations into putting that roadmap for ethics and sustainability within your organizations. And then my colleague Chris Minter, as Alan mentioned, Chris will take you through our journey in Zurich around procurement and sustainability as well. Okay, so moving into the first slide. So the first slide is we will talk about what a definition of ethical and sustainable procurement supply chain is. And the best way to do this is to sort of break it into two different concepts. So the first concept is if we talk about ethical procurement in isolation. So what is ethical procurement? So ethical procurement is effectively various procurement processes and procedures which exhibit several characteristics, which are predominantly around adhering to fundamental international standards against criminal conducts, things like bribery, corruption, and human rights abuse, such as modern slavery, and effectively addressing any deviations that are discovered within your processes to these standards that we have in industry. And the intention of having ethical procurement in place is to have progressive improvements to the lives of the people who contribute to the supply chains and are also impacted by the supply chain decisions that are made by your organizations. When we think about sustainable procurement and supply chain in itself, this then starts to consider environmental, social, and economic consequences of design, materials used, manufacturing methods, logistics, and the disposal of goods within a supply chain environment. A lot of people ask the question, how does this sort of fit into the ESG framework? And we're hoping that this pictorial that we have up on the screen effectively shows the different facets and how they link into the ESG framework. So from an environmental perspective, environment as detailed. From a social perspective, looking at issues such as diversity and inclusion, looking at global citizenship, health and safety, human rights, and labor rights. So all the social aspects within that framework. And then when we look at the governance side of things like anti-corruption, ethics and business conduct, financial integrity, supply chain responsibility, and transparency. Now, why is ethical procurement and sustainable supply chains, why is that important to organizations and to all of us as a whole? I think one of the key things to look at is to start to look at some of the UN statistics that are out there that cover the various different aspects within the supply chain. So we look at 36 billion tons of CO2 emitted globally per year by organizations around the world. The UN have also reported that we've got a relatively circa about 10 years to avoid catastrophic and irreversible damage to our planet. There are approximately 246 million child laborers in the world as we speak today. And globally, there's approximately 27 million people enslaved in some form of human trafficking. From a fraud perspective, 127 is reported that $127 trillion is lost globally from a fraud perspective, and 47% of companies suffered at least one incident of financial crime in the previous 12 months. So all these statistics sort of drive towards the challenges and the concerns within our supply chains and within the world as a whole, and it sort of starts to give that thought process around what can we do differently to improve some of these statistics, because the outlook is not a great outlook. So on the next slide, we're going to look at a short video that just talks about and shows us about the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it starts to give us a sense of the sustainability agenda and its relevance to procurement as well. So hopefully you find this video helpful and insightful. Okay. Hopefully you found that very short video. Hopefully you found that quite insightful, and it starts to sort of send the message around sustainability and ethics and why it's important within our supply chain. The foundation, especially from what we do from a Zurich perspective, from a sustainability perspective, is driven by the sustainability development goals from the UN. So we thought we'd try and make the session a bit more interactive, rather than myself and Chris talking to the audience. We thought we'd like to get a little bit of audience participation, and just to get your thoughts around the subject. So one of the questions, we've got a series of questions throughout the presentation, but one of the questions we would like to ask to start with is, what do you think are some of the drivers for change in ethical and sustainable procurement and supply chains? Can you just quickly put your answers in the chat room, and we'll start to gather some of your thoughts, and then we'll move on in the presentation. Okay, I can see some people are putting some of their thoughts through. So thank you, Sarah. Doing the right thing, social responsibility, that's absolutely correct. Thank you, Ken. Customer requirements. It's a huge reason behind this. Compliance, yes, absolutely right, Alan. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll give the audience just a couple more seconds just for a few more thoughts, and then we'll move on. The market. Thank you, Alexandra. Demonstrating to shareholders that you're doing the right thing. Thank you, Alex Mitchell. Absolutely perfect. Fantastic answers. And the answers in themselves can be broad and wide. And it's generally around a business requirements. But I think one of the key things to realize and to be aware of with all of this is that it's the right thing to do. It's about protecting the environment, protecting the people, and ensuring that our supply chains are acting in an ethical manner. So most organizations, if not every organization, has some sort of mission, vision, value, and policies behind, and procedures behind all of that. So a lot of the factors that impact that mission and vision, or support that mission and vision, are similar drivers for needing and having to have an ethical and sustainable procurement and supply chain in place. So environmental issues, reducing the impacts of the environment. Customers and shareholders and stakeholders are becoming increasingly putting a lot of pressure on organizations to act in an ethical manner. Legislative, from a legal perspective, there are lots of acts and laws coming into place that's sort of driving the need to have a sustainable and ethical supply chain in place. Professional ethics, regulations, and security of supply as well from a supply chain perspective. Continue the theme around the drivers for the change. So if we look at the main pillars around the need for an ethical and sustainable procurement and supply chain, we think about the environment. There's lots of pressures within the world today around taking care of the planet and taking care of our environment. From a social perspective, reducing the amount of child slavery, modern slavery, human trafficking that's going on within the world today. And from an economic perspective, it's just that simple rule of the fewer resources that you use, the lower your operating costs. So you can stretch your resources in itself can go further if you manage them appropriately from a sustainability perspective. Now, I put that additional pillar in place just to talk about some of the legislation that's coming into place. So in Germany, as some of us may be aware on the call, effective from the 1st of January next year, there's the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. which comes into play, which effectively means that German companies or any companies with an interest or operations within Germany have to show that they're performing the right due diligence within their supply chains against some of the factors that we just talked about: modern slavery, human trafficking, etc. From a Swiss perspective, Zurich is a Swiss company as well. From the 1st of January this year, again, another due diligence act and legislation came into place around conflict minerals and child labor as well. And in the Netherlands, from the middle of this year, the Child Labour Act will also, Due Diligence Act will also come into place. So we can see that several different countries are now starting to push the legislation around some of these topics. The Modern Slavery Act in itself is in effect in the UK, but it won't be long before some form of supply chain due diligence act makes itself apparent in the UK. I know we're not part of the EU, but likewise, Switzerland isn't part of the EU, but they're obviously taking further steps towards ensuring that that the right legislation is put in place to protect individuals. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So we will look at each of those individual pillars and some of the challenges in each and every one of them. The topic in itself is very wide. There's lots of information around it, but we're just going to pick up on some really, really key points, and we'll discuss those key points through the presentation. So when we think about from an environmental perspective, we think about issues such as, so first point on there, such as global warming and climate change. And again, we've given some examples of how procurement and supply chain can start to make a difference within each of those frameworks. So simple things such as e-procurement rather than using a paper-based system. I think a lot of people will say, oh, are there people out there that still use paper-based systems? But I think people will be surprised within organizations. There's lots of companies that still operate on a paper basis. So just making a simple change to moving to e-procurement and emailing those purchase orders as opposed to sending paper versions, or emailing invoices, or using an automated process for invoices rather than paper-based, is one simple step towards managing the challenge of global warming and climate change. Reduction in business travel and commuting where viable. Again, just a very simple process that we can put in place to help with that. And when we're thinking about climate change challenges as well, it's also important to talk about carbon emissions and scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions are effectively supply chain emissions. So scope 3 emissions effectively make up the largest portion of greenhouse gas carbon emissions that are out there. Again, it's one that's key, and it's important for organizations to start to take a step towards at least understanding their impact from a greenhouse gas perspective, and start to look at steps and ways to minimize that impact. And my colleague Chris will talk about some of the steps that we've taken from a Zurich perspective further on in the presentation. So deforestation, again, a huge, massive impact on the environment. Again, I talked about reducing the use of paper, the use of sustainable sources championed by the Forest Stewardship Council. Again, companies that deal with a lot of paper can apply for something called a chain of custody certification, which effectively means that any paper-based product that's been used from that industry can effectively certify that it's been produced from a renewable or a sustainable source. Energy, always a big one. Supply, you can ensure your organization supply from green renewable sources of energies. When you do your RFQs or request for proposals, look at energy efficient products and processes, look at green alternatives. Also have a green code of conduct in place with your supply base and with your suppliers. And we also advocate that you respond to the Carbon Disclosure Project, which talks about measuring your carbon footprint and putting key steps in place to reduce it or offset it. Pollution, huge issue again. What can procurement do? source from environmentally aware and sustainable suppliers, look at reverse logistics options, recycling of byproducts, transportation, manufacture, and energy use. These are all things that we can look at from a pollution perspective. Waste management, again, looking to develop a waste management and disposal strategy within your organization. A lot of organizations are also starting to look at the concept of the circular economy. So it's all about recycling, reuse, remanufacture of products so that there is less waste making its way out into the environment and into the world. Right, so we're going to look at the social and the human aspects. And before we quickly jump into that, again, another really quick, we'll take about 30 seconds, another really quick question to the audience. Just audience thoughts around modern slavery. When you think about the concept of modern slavery, can the audience just give me their thoughts around how many different forms of modern slavery do we think are out there? Again, just a very quick 30-second poll. Child labor, yep. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Alan. Child labor is a good, very good example. Human trafficking, perfect, Leah. Thank you. Okay, a few more seconds and then we'll move on. Paying lower the minimum wage, Judy. Yes, thank you. As an example. Sweatshops, Alex. Yes, good example. Okay, we're going to move on. We've given some examples in this slide. Again, the list can be exhaustive, unfortunately, but again, for the purposes of this presentation, we've given some examples of what our view of the different forms of modern slavery are out there. We have forced labor, debt, bondage, and bonded labor. And this is a form of modern slavery where people are made and forced to work to pay off a associated debt. Human trafficking, descent-based slavery. So people that have been signed up to slavery based on their descendancy or heritage within some countries. Child slavery in itself, and then forced and early marriage as well is another typical example of modern slavery. Now, modern slavery can exist anywhere. It can be in any country and it can be in any sector. The problem with this form of, or the problem with this issue is that the more complex your supply chain and the more global your supply chain becomes, the less visibility you have into these type of issues. Now, the key implications on procurement around some of these challenges and some of these issues are legal sanctions, loss of market share, reputational damage, transparency in the supply chain becomes an issue, and the robust recruitment methods throughout the supply chain. So effectively, there are challenges and key issues within supply chain that are affected by human rights and modern slavery. So again, carrying on the theme, how do we start to understand the risks within our various organizations? There are a number of factors that can be used to help to determine the risk of modern slavery. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. We will share the details of this slide so you can refer to them after this webinar. But there are various different forums, indexes, indicators, and websites out there that your organizations can use to effectively help you to monitor your supply chains and monitor any potential impact or insights into modern slavery or human rights abuse within your supply chain. There are also commodity specific risk-based type forums as well, where you can look at specific commodities within your organization and start to monitor start to monitor the issues within your supply chain. Supply performance is also another key method, by doing asking your suppliers to carry out the self-assessments, and then yourself as an organization also carrying out audits within your supply chain to effectively check for any issues around human rights. Again, prevention methods, three main processes: planning, putting the right policies in place, and then developing processes to drive those policies that you have in place. Again, I've talked about audits, having the audits in place, put a plan in place with the right suppliers, and you can look at different incentives. Again, there's no hard and fast rule with how your organization can implement this, but it's about having that right framework that can help you drive that process within your organization to ensure that you are taking the right steps towards prevention, and ensuring that the processes are monitored effectively. Okay, just conscious of time. Now, when we start to look at the economic factors, we start to look at fraud, bribery, and corruption. So within industry, there's various different definitions of fraud, bribery, and corruption. But I thought I'd just put this pictorial that just gives us a clear definition of each of those concepts. So fraud, any act of deception intended for personal gain. Bribery in itself, offering incentives to someone to induce them to act inappropriately, and then corruption, which is a dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in a position of power. So this just gives a clear definition of each of those concepts, and just helps us to start to think about how those concepts can impact our supply chains and our businesses. Again, the implications are vast and wide. We've just named a few of these implications. So variation abuse, billing issues, financial impacts, personal interest. We can have also issues around contract specifications. We can have issues with bidding, but it's all very prevalent from a procurement perspective. And your organizations should work towards putting steps in place to prevent these. And I guess we asked the question, how can we start to look at some of these issues within the supply chain? One of the key things that we recommend, and one of the key things that your organization can do, is to look at a corruption risk assessment heat map. And it's effectively just looking at your supply base, looking at suppliers that you work with, and start to plot those suppliers on a graph, and start to plot the potential risks and potential challenges that you could see happening with those suppliers, and specifically with respect to the kind of corruption risk that they may bring to your organization. Again, sticking with the economic factors as well, how can you start to mitigate risk? So three main things is establishing a clear and robust supplier selection process and criteria within your organization. So looking at several prerequisites, which all move towards the very clear ethical standards. A lot of organizations look at supplier code of conducts, which they ask their suppliers to adhere to before they take them on as a supplier. Validate your suppliers' anti-corruption policies and procedures, do lots of background and financial checks on your suppliers, evaluate your suppliers' capacities and use of subcontractors. And a common thing that they in organizations I've worked with in the past is something called an eyes open audit. So when you go into your supply base, you don't necessarily tell them that you completed an audit, but if you go for a supplier meeting, a supplier visit, just have your eyes wide open and just observe some of the processes and situations that are happening within those organizations. In terms of money laundering, you can look at you can analyze your supplier spend patterns, ensure that they align to expectations, and avoid over reliance on a single supplier as well. well, as that puts financial strain on that particular supplier. Ensure compliance for procurement to be able to deter any sort of unethical behavior. So this is an internal process where you train up your personnel, train up your internal staff who work in that procurement function to ensure that that they are adhering to the right policies and procedures. So again, I think this is the final question from our side. So again, quick poll again, barriers and challenges, if any, do you think your organization will have towards achieving ethical procurement and sustainable supply chain? Again, just quick, let's take about 20 to 30 seconds on this one. What do you think are sort of barriers and challenges? Cultural changes within an organization. Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely right. Too many suppliers to check. Yes. Capacity issues. Thank you. Alan. Alex, a third party not following the rules you've set out. Absolutely right, Alex. Thank you. Not understanding why or what needs to be done. Thank you, Judy. Okay. While people are still typing, I'll move on to the next slide. By the way, there again, as you find a theme with a lot of things around ethics and sustainability, they're probably the topic is very wide and is very vast. You know, there's lots of different reasons and issues and challenges. So there is really no right or wrong answer to this. But some concepts from and from our viewpoint is that a supply base is lacking in supply of sustainable assets, services, or supplies. So basically, they don't know how to do this or they don't know how to implement this. Breaking habits and difficulty in changing behaviors, complexity of qualifying the value of social, environmental, and economic factors. Some people cannot put a value to it. So again, it's difficult in trying to measure or trying to show people what you're achieving in that space. The difficulty of including factors broader than environmental considerations. And the time needed to find solutions to problems. So when you find a problem in your supply chain, how long is it going to take you to fix that issue? Quality as well, ensuring that quality is built throughout the entire sustainability process and is the heart of everything that we do. And then cost, again, trying to ascertain or put a cost behind an ethical procurement and sustainable supply chain is always a very, very difficult one to have in place. So the journey, again, just thinking about time, I won't go through all of this in detail, but effectively, your organization, if they do not have this in place, they need to start thinking about putting a roadmap and a journey in place to actually achieve it, because this is the future and sustainability is the right thing to do for most organizations. And I think to start to send a message within your organizations is to start to try to make that change. Now, one of the key things to do from a supply chain perspective is to ask for their early engagement in whatever business project that may involve a supply chain. Your supply chain people, personnel, operators need to get involved as quickly as possible so that those sustainability selections, those ethical procurement selections can be made quite early on in a procurement process and not later on as an afterthought, because it becomes more difficult. You can work with your engineering and your product design teams to look at how products are designed, manufactured, how can less raw materials that impact the environment be used, and how can effectively more renewable sources and more sustainable sources be adopted. So there's a whole host of things that organizations can do to start to move towards this process. And like I said, my colleague shortly, Chris, will talk about some of the stuff that we've done from a Zurich perspective. Again, just some advice about what steps your organization can take towards achieving this. First step, understand what your current status quo through assessment. So assess your business requirements, assess your business needs, then define your targets and expectations. Once you've done that, you develop a business case and you get stakeholder commitments in terms of starting and embarking on that journey towards an ethical and sustainable procurement and supply chain. And then implementation. You implement, and don't just implement and walk away. You implement, you start to measure, and you start to communicate with your supply base, and you start to put a level of continuous monitoring in place with your supply chains. And then finally, the bit that everybody likes, why are we doing this? What are the benefits to organizations? So we talked about the brand and reputational benefits. We've talked about the potential to lower your overall costs as a business. It's not always the case, but in more cases than not, if you do it right, you will lower your costs. Reduction in waste. And the consumers, they start to trust your organizations because they see that you are doing the right thing. You're following an ethical path and you're developing a sustainable supply chain. Also, with the issues with regards to compliance, again, with the legislations, the regulations coming in place, your companies will look to develop that compliance, in some cases way ahead of that legislation kicking in. So again, taking that proactive step and that proactive approach to having an ethical and sustainable supply chain, rather than it being an afterthought and something that you do later on, which then becomes not quite efficient for your business. And just to quote a study that was done by McKinsey in 2021, it showed that the top ESG performers enjoyed faster growth and higher valuations than other players in their sectors by a margin of between 10 and 20%, which is huge. So strong ESG credentials drive down costs by 5 to 10%. So these are studies that have been done by McKinsey and effectively show the need and the benefit that you get from starting an ethical procurement and sustainable supply chain journey. So without further ado, I will pass you on to my colleague, Chris, and Chris will take you through our Zurich journey and what we're doing currently.
Thank you there, Namdi. Okay, guys. Hello there. Thank you for the opportunity for sharing our story at Zurich about our sustainable sourcing adventure. I've been with Zurich for 6 or so years and I lead our global sustainable sourcing program. Firstly, I think it's important to start with some context about sustainability and what it means for us in our company at Zurich. And sustainability is really embedded into the DNA of our company. And we have an ambition to be one of the world's most responsible and impactful businesses. And we can only achieve this if all corporate functions and business units in our global organization take responsibility for sustainability and embed it into their day-to-day operations. Sustainability isn't something that can just be handled at the center from a core small team and rolled out across the company. It really requires a collective effort. Now, this slide here is showing you an extract from our most recent sustainability report, which is published on our website on zurich.com. And to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the most material sustainability factors and ESG issues of concern to our overall company. And this is what guides our global sustainability approach for the company. And you'll see here towards the middle section of the materiality matrix, the responsible supply chain. And this is an issue that even for Zurich, an insurance company that doesn't have a supply chain, generally speaking, of physical goods and items, we are not, generally speaking, extracting raw materials. We don't have that many factories in our supply chain, for example, but still having a responsible and sustainable supply chain is a material issue of concern for Zurich. And in my view, this is driven by three primary things. Firstly, our stakeholders. It's important to our stakeholders that we embed sustainability in our business and particularly in our supply chain. And we see increasingly customers making decisions about the insurer that they wish to work with based upon the sustainability credentials. So it's important that for us and for our clients and other stakeholders that we integrate sustainability into our business and including in our supply chain. There's increasingly there's There's an increasing prevalence of external reporting requirements for our company. As a financial services and insurance organization, we're increasingly having to make disclosures about the sustainability of our supply chain. And this is an excellent driver for us to get executive support and sponsorship for pushing the agenda even more. And of course, as Namdi mentioned, there's increasing legislation and ESG risks that require companies to do more on sustainable supply chains. Now, there's 3 or 4 key issues of concern for our suppliers, from our stakeholders in respect of our sustainable supply chain. And the first of those really is supply due diligence, monitoring and governance. Our stakeholders expect us to have processes to validate the credentials of our supply chain and ensure ethical outcomes. So we at Zurich operate a supply due diligence, monitoring and governance framework, of which sustainability is a core intrinsic part of that. We also focus deeply on our own emissions and our own scope 3 emissions, which includes those relating to our suppliers. And whilst we're not in direct control of our supplier emissions, we still aim to engage and influence our suppliers to adopt more sustainable and environmentally sustainable practices to reduce and better control our scope 3 emissions. And then, of course, we have a deep focus on human rights, particularly so in Europe, where the regulations are the strongest and continue to emerge, but we have a deep focus on human rights and embedding that into our due diligence framework. But importantly, it's increasingly common that companies are looking to drive social impact, positive social impact, not just ensuring ethical outcomes, but also driving real positive social impact within the communities that our supply chain operates. And I'll come on to these in a moment or so. So this slide here visualizes our sustainable sourcing program and how we aim to embed environmental, social and ethical factors throughout our sourcing lifecycle. And the ring around the outside, the 7 steps of our sustainable sourcing process. And our program is anchored in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we saw the short overview video of earlier. But each of the pillars of our program, our sustainable sourcing program, are anchored in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned, and we have a key objective for each assigned that we aim to measure our progress against. If I start with a bit about our journey and most recent deliverables, then in June of 2021, last year, we published our first supplier code of conduct, which really set out some clear environmental, social and ethical outcomes for and expectations for our suppliers. And we started on a journey now to carry out due diligence and to evaluate our suppliers really against these expectations that we've set. So internally, we've built ourselves an assessment tool and a dashboard, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, where we calculate ourselves a sustainability score for our suppliers based upon the questionnaires and surveys that they provide to us. And we've set the ambition last year that by the end of this year, we would have engaged with about 75% of our supply chain, which equates our supplier spend in any given year is around $2 billion. So this is around $1.5 billion or so of spend that we are ensuring to be aligned to our supply code of conduct. With respect to our supply chain emissions, now scope 3 emissions are something that many companies struggle with, but at Zurich, in partnership with the Carbon Disclosure Project with CDP, we have gathered supply chain emissions for a large proportion of our supply chain spend. We've actually got emissions data from nearly 56% of our supplier spend, and then we've carried out some analysis to gauge a weighted average for the rest to extrapolate the estimated supply chain emissions for our total supply chain. But again, this is a tool that we've built internally through Power BI to model and identify the hotspots in our own supply chain emissions. And whilst, as I mentioned earlier, our supply chain emissions are outside the scope of our operational boundary, we still aim to influence and move suppliers to more environmentally sustainable business practices. And we've set ourselves a target that by 2025, we aim to have 75% of our managed procurement spend to be with companies that have adopted science-based targets for emissions reduction. And a science-based emission reduction target is a target for reducing emissions, which is aligned to the latest climate science and will help us as a planet avoid the worst implications of climate change by capping temperature increases at no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Our approach to having suppliers to meeting the target and for influencing our suppliers is based upon 3 core pillars. Firstly, we're communicating our expectations very clearly in our RFP documents, in our tender documents, on our website. When we're talking to suppliers at contract renewal, we're really pushing the boundaries with our sustainability approach and making it clear what we expect of them. We're providing extensive training internally to our global procurement teams, so that they can understand and be conversant in sustainability, the 3 pillars, and our approach at Zurich, because these are topics that can be quite complicated, particularly on the emissions reporting. So it's important that we've made the investments that we need to do to upskill our teams so that they can have these discussions with suppliers with confidence. And then thirdly, building upon the training and with our people having the knowledge that they need, we are increasingly incorporating environmental criteria into the decisions that we make for purchasing. So we will prioritize, or aim to prioritize, the more environmentally sustainable companies, those with a lower carbon footprint, than those in equivalent industry that do not. I mentioned earlier, and Namdi highlighted the critical importance of safeguarding human rights, but we aim to go above just safeguarding human rights, but also generate positive social impact. And primarily we're doing this through 2 ways. We're engaging with and aiming to increasingly engage with diverse suppliers, which are certified diverse suppliers owned and controlled by companies, owned and controlled by historically underutilized economic groups. And this could include minority-owned businesses, it could include female-owned businesses, and other similar businesses. And this is really a large focus for our business in North America, in the US, but also increasingly it's a growing concept in the UK and also in Australia as well. We have active programs of work underway to support the development of these businesses and to increase the number that we have in our supply chain. And in addition to the diverse suppliers that we work with, we also look for opportunities and seek out opportunities for social enterprises. And these are businesses that exist to provide goods and services and make a profit. They're not charities, but they have a core social or environmental mission in their heart. And they use the profits and business that they generate to reinvest back into their social mission. So if I give you an example with Give Me Tap, they are a company that produces bottled water, and they reinvest their profits to help alleviate water poverty challenges in Africa. So they use the profits they generate to fund that social mission. But there's a real growing number of social enterprises in the UK and elsewhere in Europe and beyond that we're increasingly seeking to engage with. And that kind of brings my short whistle-stop tour of sustainable sourcing at Zurich to a close. So Alan, I'll hand to you for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and yeah, thanks, Namdi. That was really insightful. What I would like to do now is we've got a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone has a question, please either put it in the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand, use the raise hand function. You can directly ask your question to Namdi and/or Chris. So please feel free to add your questions in now. I see there's a bit of typing going on, which is good. So just while we're waiting for questions to come through, I mean, I suppose what does the future look like in terms of, we talked about, this is a real driving force. We've talked about the potential for legislation in this area, changing customer attitudes, that type of thing. What does the future look like? Do you think? I'll come to you first on that one, Namdi.
I think ultimately, because of what we're seeing in the EU, and I think during my presentation, I gave the example about what Switzerland is doing, and they're not part of the EU, but they're putting the Conflict Minerals and Child Labour Due Diligence Act in place, which is going to become mandatory. And I think that is a sort of message for the UK as well, because I don't think it will be long before before that legislation or some form of legislation to that effect will kick in the UK, and start to force organizations to look at their supply chains and to look at their procurement, ethical procurement functions. It's just a question of time. So I think organizations need to get ahead of the game if they're not already in the game, or intensify their efforts based on where they are today.
Thanks, Namdi. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to echo Namdi's comments there, really. Whereas in the past, I think ethical or sustainable supply chains has been something that's like a nice to have, or an optional. It's increasingly so that regulations mean that these are becoming mandatory practices for all companies, regardless of whether they have a physical supply chain or largely, or as alternatively like Zurich, where it's mainly services.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So Damien has asked about the slides. In fact, yeah, so absolutely, we will share the slides after the session, and those can be shared with whoever you want to share them with. Damien, Sarah has asked, what are some of the challenges Zurich have faced with sustainable sourcing? Because I don't imagine this has been an easy process, or it is always easy. We must face challenges, Chris, I guess.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. So, I mean, often there's a misconception that to have a more sustainable choice, there needs to be some kind of trade-off, be that cost, quality, and often people would come to a misconception that, for example, a social enterprise or a diverse supplier would be more expensive or less capable than the regular supplier that's always served that need. But that's just not the case. We've been able to show many examples where social enterprises, diverse suppliers have been in some cases more competitive, certainly more innovative often than incumbent suppliers that don't have these issues. So that's certainly been a challenge that we had to overcome to begin with.
Yeah, so there's sort of ingrained biases, if you like, that we're switching, so therefore we might not get the same quality, or it's going to be more difficult, or we're only doing this for the kind of sake of doing something in the right way. Okay, and we've got another question in the chat from Damien. Did you see any resistance when introducing your code of conduct, and how did you ensure suppliers have accepted and acknowledged it?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think sometimes with a code of conduct or supply code of conduct, there's the risk of the battle of the forms, where one supplier pushes theirs and the customer maybe has their own. But so yeah, there's always a resistance to some extent. But I mean, largely speaking, we've had an excellent reception from suppliers. And what we aim to do really is to use our influence. I mentioned before that we spend roughly $2 billion or so a year, which is a large amount of money. So there are a number of companies that we're an important client to, and this matters to us, and it's a priority for us in our supplier decisions and supplier selection decisions. But we speak with credibility, because all of the standards that we've set out in our supply code of conduct are all based upon things that as a company we've already adopted ourselves. So we're basically expecting our suppliers, or we see our suppliers as an extension of our company, and expect them to be aligning to the expectations and things that we've already done. So if a supplier isn't already on the pathway, isn't already meeting expectations we've set, then yeah, we work with them, we explain why this is important, and we aim to support their transition to sustainable practices. At this moment, we don't plan to immediately phase out or cut off suppliers, but we do expect there to be progress to the sustainability standards that we've set.
Yeah, just to add to what Chris has said as well, I think again, if you look at the reverse side of things, where you have an organization that may not necessarily have that leverage or that clout with their supply base to be able to implement that change, I think it's one of the things about having an open and honest conversation with your supply base about it being the right thing to do first and foremost, and then about sharing best practices, and again have that discussion around the brand, the reputation, the impact on the environment. And I think it's about showing and having that collaborative approach and taking the best practices and saying to your supply base, even if you haven't got that leverage, but showing to them the advantages that we talked about in some of the detail in some of this presentation around the advantages of doing the right thing, because you will get a lot of resistance. And I think that was something has happened in the past. I think fast forward to where we are now today, with sustainability where it is, and obviously having seen the impacts of on the environment of climate change, and all of the various different impacts, I think people are starting to see the real need to do this and to put this in place. So I'll be surprised if there's suppliers out there that will not want to sign up to the code of conduct just for the fact that it's the right thing to do.
No, thank you. Thanks, Nnamdi, and thanks, Chris. I'll draw this to a close then, as we're approaching 12 o'clock. I'd just like to thank you and thank everyone for participating in the session. I think some of the things I kind of took away from it is this is certainly not a topic that's going away. It's becoming more important. So I think, as you've alluded to there, Nnamdi, I think organisations that just pay lip service to this, that's not really going to be a sustainable option going forward. And it also seems to me as this is a journey. There's no organisation that's perfect at this, is there? But it's about understanding kind of, well, what's driving it? What are my organisation's standards, expectations? And then kind of how do we ensure those standards get met, and getting suppliers on board with that through compliance type stuff, but also kind of hearts and minds, if you like, of, you know, this is why we're doing it and this is why we're taking the approach we're taking. So thank you to everyone for participating. I do have one final quick poll, if you wouldn't mind completing it. It's anonymous. It should be on your screen now. Just quick feedback in terms of how you've found the session today, and while you're answering that, we'll email you a copy of the slides used later on today. I'll also include details in that email of further webinars that we are running around supply chain, different aspects of supply chain. So and I'll include details of how you can register for those. Yeah, if you get any issues or any questions you want to follow up on today, you can email us at zrs.inquiries there, or reach out to Chris and Nnamdi on LinkedIn. They're both quite active, so they'll both be delighted to engage with you there as well, if you want to and you find that useful. Other than that, I will draw the session to a close, and thank you.